Bruce Lee was challenged by a Muay Thai legend. 10 seconds later, reality couldn't keep up. It began with a challenge issued in public, a name spoken with certainty, a weighty presence testing a smaller frame. Within 10 seconds, the room, filled with spectators expecting spectacle, fell into an unexpected stillness. The challenger remained upright, unbroken, but the momentum of certainty had already shifted. Those who watched later would speak of it in hushed tones, not as a fight won or lost, but as a quiet unraveling of expectation, witnessed and remembered. The outcome was immediate, undeniable, yet the method remained almost invisible, leaving only the subtle proof of mastery behind. The hall was modest, wooden floors worn smooth by years of training, walls lined with photographs of past champions, their faces captured in mid-motion yet frozen by time. A faint scent of liniment and sweat hung in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of incense burning quietly in a corner. Outside, the city hummed, but inside, time seemed suspended, measured only by the rhythm of practice. Local fighters moved in pairs, their motions precise, honed by countless repetitions. Each kick, each elbow, was a language of its own, spoken softly yet unmistakably understood. The room exhaled discipline, and every visitor sensed the weight of that collective expectation. Outsiders, even those of notable skill, rarely drew attention here. Respect had to be earned. Word had begun to circulate before he arrived. A foreign martial artist, smaller in frame, but with a reputation whispered across distant gyms. Some smiled at the thought, quietly amused. Others watched with curiosity, noting the subtle shift as new eyes scanned the hall, unhurried, unassuming. There was no announcement, no demand for attention. He merely appeared at the threshold, observing, calculating, his posture unremarkable yet precise. The fighters sensed the unfamiliar presence, and with it, a tension unlike the usual sparring. Conversations dwindled. Movements slowed slightly. It was not fear, nothing so dramatic, but a heightened awareness, a recognition that the normal patterns of authority in this space might not hold. Outside, the sunlight filtered through bamboo blinds, casting thin lines across the floor. Inside, eyes followed him, noting how he moved with a stillness that suggested control rather than display. The hall had seen challengers before, some boastful, some reckless, but this was different. The quiet certainty in his gaze carried its own authority, and without a word, he had begun to stake a claim in the room's attention. It was here, among the watchers and the observed, that the first subtle shifts began. Muscles tensed just slightly, postures adjusted, the air thickened with expectation. The stage was set, not with banners or announcements, but with the careful, measured awareness of those who had long understood what mastery felt like when it arrived silently. And in that stillness, observers would later say, one could sense inevitability. Not in speed, not in volume, but in the quiet certainty that, within moments, something the room had not anticipated would unfold. The door at the far end of the hall opened with a subtle creak, and a figure entered. He moved deliberately, each step measured, aware of the eyes upon him without seeming to acknowledge them. Not a single gesture was exaggerated. There was no attempt to impress. Yet the room responded instantly, an unspoken recognition of presence, of experience. He was large, broader than most in the hall, a body honed by decades of training. His reputation as a Muay Thai legend had preceded him, carried in whispered stories of fights that had ended quietly but decisively. His gaze swept the room with a careful appraisal, lingering on each pair of sparring fighters, noting stance, rhythm, and balance. There was no need to speak. His authority was communicated entirely through observation. The air shifted. Some fighters straightened, unconsciously adjusting posture as if reminded of the hierarchy that had long governed this hall. Conversations ceased. Even the clatter of practice pads and gloves slowed. The legend did not speak, did not challenge. He merely existed in the room, and his existence alone carried weight. Spectators, positioned along the edges of the hall, began to sense the contrast between him and the smaller foreign visitor who had already claimed the room's quiet attention. Here was confidence, honed through years of repeated, successful confrontations. There was power in every controlled movement, precision in every glance, and an expectation that others would adapt to him, not the other way around. The foreign visitor, standing opposite, made no motion to meet or respond. He remained still, his eyes calm, his body relaxed yet ready. There was no acknowledgement, no attempt to compete visibly. And yet, this stillness introduced a subtle friction into the space, a psychological tension that was felt rather than seen. Those who watched later recalled the silence that followed. The room seemed to inhale collectively, waiting. Not for a clash, not for spectacle, but for the moment when two forms of mastery, so different in scale and style, would occupy the same space. The tension was quiet but absolute, rooted in observation, expectation, and the unspoken challenge that had been placed without words. In this hall, the legend had arrived with authority. And in that quiet exchange of presence, observers began to understand that mastery was not measured only by size, by reputation, or by history. It could also be measured by composure, timing, and the subtle claim of control, even before a single strike was made. The spectators began to lean forward, not in excitement, but in concentration. Every subtle shift in posture, every slight adjustment of stance, was noted and measured. Conversations had all but disappeared, replaced by a quiet, collective awareness that something rare was unfolding. This was not a spectacle meant for cheering. It was an examination of skill, presence, and control, unfolding in real time. The Muay Thai legend moved with deliberate, unhurried steps, probing the space. Small feints, slight shifts of weight, and measured jabs were deployed not to strike, but to test. Each motion was minimal, almost imperceptible, yet the foreign visitor responded only with observation, never with a mirrored motion. There was no visible defense, no attempt to counter, only a quiet absorption of information. In that silence, the tension thickened. The room began to feel the subtle imbalance. Authority and expectation weighed against calm precision. The legend had long relied on experience, intuition, and a reputation forged over countless encounters. Yet here, that reputation was held in a strange suspension, challenged not by noise, not by aggression, but by the absence of reaction. The foreign visitor's stillness forced the legend, and the room, to reconsider the assumptions of dominance. Witnesses later described a shift in rhythm. Movements that once felt natural to the fighters began to feel tentative. Hesitations emerged, small at first but noticeable. Eyes flicked from the foreign visitor to the legend, measuring, comparing, trying to anticipate the invisible line of authority being drawn. The tension was not sudden or loud. It was a slow compression, a pressing stillness that spoke louder than any shout or strike could. Even the air seemed to hold itself, as though the hall itself recognized the anomaly of this encounter. Spectators were drawn into the observation, caught between awe and comprehension. This was not a fight in the conventional sense. It was a silent negotiation of presence, a psychological interplay made visible only through restraint, subtlety, and timing. And then, in the stillness, the inevitability of what would follow began to settle quietly over the hall. Not everyone understood it in that moment. Some would only grasp it in hindsight, but a sense of control had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the legend to the one who had refused to move unnecessarily. The tension had built not through action, but through observation, patience, and the quiet assertion of skill. Then, with a movement almost too small to register, the foreign visitor acted. There was no shout, no dramatic flourish. A shift of weight, a subtle adjustment of stance, and the space between him and the Muay Thai legend changed imperceptibly. In that quiet, measured motion, the hall sensed a transfer of control, not by force, but by absolute timing and precision. The legend reacted instinctively, as all experienced fighters do, but the response came a fraction too late. Not because he had been slow, but because the foreign visitor's mastery was not measured in speed. It was measured in anticipation, in understanding the rhythm of the room, the momentum of each step, the micro-timing of every gesture. One simple, minimal motion disrupted expectation and shifted balance. Observers later recounted how the demonstration required no aggression. There was no contact that caused harm, yet the authority was undeniable. The legend's usual composure faltered briefly, subtle, almost invisible, and in that fraction of a second, the room collectively recognized a hierarchy that had been quietly re-established. The foreign visitor's efficiency left nothing extraneous. No wasted movement, no noise, no show, only control, only proof of capability, expressed silently. The Muay Thai legend adjusted, recalibrating. Yet the subtle imprint of the foreign visitor's presence had already taken hold. Confidence was no longer assumed. It was questioned, examined. The quiet mastery was not an attack. It was an assertion, a demonstration that power could exist without display, that authority could be maintained without spectacle. Witnesses described the hall as if holding its breath, aware that what they were seeing was not a fleeting victory, but a lesson in presence, timing, and restraint. The shift in control did not provoke alarm. It provoked recognition. Here was a proof not in noise or pain, but in quiet efficiency and exactness, an incontrovertible demonstration of skill that required no embellishment. Even the air seemed to pause, the usual hum of practice falling away entirely. Spectators, fighters, and the legend himself were all caught in the momentary recalibration of expectation. The lesson was not spoken, yet it resonated in every observing eye. Mastery can assert itself without demand, can dominate without aggression, and can teach without words. By the end of those few seconds, the hall understood that the confrontation had already concluded. It was not dramatic, not violent, but absolute. Quiet mastery had been revealed, and it required only the patience, precision, and unwavering calm of one who understood that less could be infinitely more. After those few subtle movements, the Muay Thai legend's rhythm began to falter. Not dramatically, not with forceful defeat, but with a series of tiny hesitations that, to the trained eye, spoke volumes. Each step was slightly off, each pivot delayed, each instinctive response measured against a foreign standard of timing and precision that refused to conform to expectation. Observers later described a moment of stillness in the hall, almost as if time itself had acknowledged the shift. The legend, usually a figure of unwavering confidence, paused, adjusting stance repeatedly, testing angles, recalibrating. The movement was deliberate, careful, but the room noticed something more. An internal recognition, subtle yet absolute, that his authority was no longer uncontested. It was not pain or exhaustion that caused the falter. It was the quiet, persistent assertion of skill, expressed without violence. The foreign visitor had done nothing overt, yet the psychological weight of mastery was undeniable. Confidence, once assumed, now required verification. The legend's eyes flicked, scanning, searching for cues, attempting to regain control. But every small motion by the visitor preempted expectation, leaving no foothold for assertion. The spectators absorbed this quietly. No cheers or murmurs punctuated the room. There was no need. The lesson was clear in posture, in hesitation, in the tiny recalibration of those who had once assumed dominance was defined solely by reputation or size. Silence carried meaning far more effectively than any shout or strike could have. Witnesses later reflected on the subtle expressions that passed across faces, the moment of realization that a confrontation need not be loud to be decisive. The hall had seen countless fighters, countless challenges, yet few encounters left such an indelible mark. The legend, for all his experience, had encountered a form of mastery that spoke to something deeper. Patience, timing, observation, and the quiet control of space and expectation. By the time the hall exhaled collectively, the shift had been made. The Muay Thai legend continued to stand, upright and composed, but something fundamental had changed. The story of authority, of presence, of hierarchy within that space had been quietly rewritten. Observers did not see a dramatic defeat. They saw comprehension, acknowledgement, and a lesson that would linger far longer than any immediate display of skill. And in that quiet understanding, the hall absorbed its most profound moment of the day. Mastery is not always measured in strikes landed or techniques executed. It is measured in control, in the subtle recalibration of expectation, and in the awareness that authority, once unchallenged, can be redefined without a sound. Years later, those who had been present in the hall recounted the encounter not as a fight, but as a story of presence. It was rarely spoken in loud tones, never celebrated with trophies or headlines. Instead, it was remembered quietly, a moment that lingered in memory like a faint echo of authority, subtle yet unmistakable. The foreign visitor departed soon after the demonstration, leaving no trace beyond the impressions of those who had watched. The Muay Thai legend returned to his training, but the rhythm of his practice had changed. Movements once automatic were now informed by the memory of that precise silent mastery. A pause before a strike, a slight adjustment in stance, small, almost imperceptible refinements that reflected lessons learned without a word ever spoken. Observers carried the lesson beyond the hall. Students, teachers, and spectators alike would recall the scene decades later, recounting the event with care, emphasizing the absence of spectacle over the presence of skill. It became a quiet legend, shared not for entertainment, but for its demonstration of principle. That control can be exercised silently, authority can be asserted without aggression, and mastery can endure long after the moment has passed. The hall itself seemed to retain the memory. Practices continued, but with a subtle gravity, a recognition that true skill is measured not by the applause it earns, but by the calm it inspires. Stories of the encounter circulated among practitioners, shaping how new generations approach training, observation, and patience. The event became a benchmark not of victory but of understanding, the kind of understanding that transforms expectation into reflection. Even decades later, when the legend and the visitor were separated by continents and years, the memory persisted. Witnesses spoke of it in quiet tones, often pausing mid-story, aware that what had occurred could not be replicated by mere repetition or technique. It was a demonstration of presence, of timing, of efficiency, the embodiment of lessons that required restraint, humility, and observation to truly grasp. In the end, the encounter was remembered not for who moved first or struck last, but for what it revealed about mastery itself. It left no scars, no loud proclamations, only the enduring impression of control, calm, and authority. And in that silence, it continued to teach, quietly shaping the minds and movements of those who sought to understand the subtle power of mastery unspoken.